The scar on Taos Three was a violent interruption in the desert's lazy eternity. A blackened furrow of fused sand cut across the dunes as if the sky had fallen and tried to burrow into the planet. Heat still trembled above it, making the air shimmer. Jake Novak stood at its edge, boots crunching on glassy slag, a steaming mug of coffee in his hand. He'd spent years reading the history of ships in their shattered hulls, tracing impact angles, burn patterns, and stress fractures the way some people read old diaries. But this wreck squatting at the end of the scar wasn't like anything he'd seen before. It wasn't the usual orbital junk the salvage station dragged out of the void. The metal skin of the craft shimmered with an unsettling softness, dark and glossy, healing itself in slow ripples. Strips of torn hull whereupon back together with a faint, organic pulse. Like a wounded animal taking shallow breaths, elegant, expensive, and unmistakably alien. Station protocols ran through Jake's mind like a checklist he intended to ignore. Secure the site, quarantine, report, wait for authorization. But the cockpit canopy of the sleek, teardrop-shaped craft was half buried in the sand, and through the cracked, translucent surface he could see a figure slumped motionless inside. Jake took another sip of coffee, more out of habit than calm, set the mug on a half-melted rock, and climbed onto the hull. The canopy lock wasn't mechanical. It was grown-veined with etched sigils and faintly glowing seams. When he touched it, the ship reacted like it recognized an intrusion, the surface stiffening under his palm. He worked a portable cutter in careful arcs until the seal hissed and spit. Hot air rushing past his face. She was inside, striking in a way that made his brain stumble over the word human. Pale blue skin etched with shifting geometric tattoos that glowed and dimmed like a living circuit board. Pointed ears, armor that drank in the harsh desert light instead of reflecting it. Each plate a segment of unfamiliar technology that looked both ceremonial and brutally functional. She was alive but barely. Her breathing was shallow, her pulse stuttering under his fingers. The station manager's voice crackled in his ear, high with panic. "Novak, for the love of all that burns, do not breach that vessel. We don't know what pathogens." "Mute," Jake said, and the channel went quiet. Protocol could wait. The woman in the cockpit could not. He pulled her free of the harness, surprised by how light she was despite the armor, and half carried. Half slid her down the cooling hull. The desert wind scraped at them, tugging at the scorched edges of the crash site as he hauled her toward his workshop. A low dome of scavenged plating, jury-rigged solar rays, and antennae, built at the edge of the salvage yard like a hermit's nest of metal. He didn't know it yet, but by the time he laid her on his medic cot and set the station's autodock humming, Jake Novak had already shifted the course of galactic history simply by choosing to play Samaritan. She woke 12 hours later with a sharp inhale and eyes like molten gold snapping into awareness. "Easy," Jake said from his stool beside the cot. "You're safe, more or less. Personally, anyway. Legally, I've probably committed for major violations." She blinked, absorbing the cramped workshop, racks of tools, half-disassembled engines, cables snaking across the floor, holo displays flickering with diagnostic data from her ship. Her gaze finally landed on him. "Where am I?" she asked, voice low but steady. "Salvage station K-47. Taos 3, outer rim." He tilted his head. "You crashed. I helped." "You're welcome." A faint, practiced smile touched her mouth. "Zara," she said. "Private security. Cargo run. Pirates hit us coming out of hyperspace. They didn't think I'd make it this far." Jake had heard the story a dozen times. From smugglers and marks limping through the rim with patched hulls and convenient lies. It fits so neatly into familiar patterns it practically came with a form to fill out. But as days passed and she recovered, the cracks in that neat story began to show. They started repairing her ship together. The self-healing hull needed guidance. Whatever biometal it was made of wanted to mend in ways that would have locked systems and sealed critical access ports. Zara moved through the repair process with a fluid certainty that made Jake's engineering brain sit up and pay attention. She didn't just understand advanced systems, she anticipated them. She gestured toward a conduit before a sensor flagged it as a problem, rerouting power inelegant. Efficient loops Jake wouldn't have thought of in a week of simulations. She recalibrated his diagnostic tools on the fly, pushing them to resolutions they'd never technically been designed for. "You're very good at this for private security," he remarked after she rebuilt. "Half a neural control lattice by hand." "Good teachers," she said lightly. "Hands never slowing. Lots of practice. You learn fast when failure means explosive decompression." Their routines settled into a comfortable rhythm. Days bled together under the desert sun and the workshop's artificial lights. Metal sang under welders, engines hummed, and the air carried the constant undertone of ozone and hydraulic fluid dot in that shared labor. The usual layers of performance thinned. Jake found himself telling her stories about other wrecks, about foolish captains and clever smugglers, about the way people left their hopes and mistakes etched into metal. She listened with a focus he wasn't used to, asking careful questions, laughing at the right moments, eyes warm rather than regal. Yet every time he nudged the conversation toward her past, toward the Veltani worlds he'd only heard rumors about. The Galactic core, the oddly formal cut of her armor she deflected with a diplomat's ease. A joke here, a redirect there, a seemingly harmless anecdote that gave away nothing. It wasn't until the fourth day that the mask finally slipped. Jake came in from checking an exterior relay to find her at the ship's communication console, fingers flicking through layers of encrypted traffic. She didn't notice him at first. His gaze snagged on the holo for just a second long enough. The encryption headers weren't military standard, at least not any he recognized. They were royal. His stomach dropped as he read the address line on an incoming message. "Your Imperial Majesty." He cleared his throat. "Something you forgot to mention, Zara?" She froze, shoulders tightening. The console winked out, the hologram collapsing into dark glass. Slowly, she turned. The confrontation that followed was quiet, but the air in the workshop felt suddenly thin. Jake folded his arms. "Your Imperial Majesty?" For a heartbeat she seemed poised to lie again. Then something in her posture eased, not surrender, exactly, but acceptance. "I didn't want to involve you," she said. "You were supposed to be a detour, a safe place to land. Fix the ship. Leave. You didn't need the weight of who I am. Try me. She exhaled. I am Zara Velton. By law, blood, and too many ceremonial oaths, Empress of the Veltani Empire, pieces fell into place. The armor, the neural interface, the instinctive command in her voice when she asked for a tool, and somehow made it sound like an order to an entire fleet. The quiet, ingrained assumption that people would listen. The crash. Jake asked. A coup, she said. Traditionalists in the High Fleet. Admiral the Var is their figurehead. They call my policies weakness. They fear what opening the Empire will do to their power. They tried to kill me and claim I died in an accident. If I went public too soon, we risked splitting the Empire into civil war. So I ran, here, to a scrapyard, Jake said dryly. Good choice. Neutral ground, she replied. A place no one important ever looks at until they have to. The universe did not intend to let her hide much longer. The proximity alarm screamed as they finished the last of the repairs. Red indicators flickered across Jake's consoles as three massive signatures dropped out of hyperspace, high in Taos Three's sky. Imperial warships. They're early, Zara muttered, already moving. On the sensor display, the ships fanned out in a combat formation, their vector lines converging on the salvage station. No hail, no attempt at communication. They're not here to rescue you, Jake said, throat tight. No, she said. They're here to erase me. They didn't have a plan so much as one desperate option. The ship was built for a single pilot. Its interior was all tight curves shaped around one body and a neural interface cradle. Not exactly luxury seating for to. Jake wedged himself into the cramped cargo compartment, pressed between sealed crates and smooth, alien bulkheads. If I die in here, he called out. I want it on record that this was a terrible idea. Duly noted, Zara said from the cockpit. Her voice had shed the easy warmth she'd worn in the workshop. This tone was crisp, absolute, an Empress slipping fully into command. Engines roared to life. The ship shuddered, systems spooling up. A hum crawled through the hull, rising in pitch until it was almost beyond hearing. Then came 43 minutes of sustained terror. From his miserable vantage point, Jake watched tactical overlays on a small secondary display. Zara jacked into the neural interface. He saw the moment the link went live as her heartbeat and the ship's core sensed. The vessel responded to her thoughts in ways no manual controls could match. She didn't just fly. She moved through the battlefield like it was an extension of her own body. Gravity nets slammed toward them, invisible fields trying to drag them back into the planet's grip. Zara twisted between the beams, driving the ship into stomach-lurching vectors that would have liquefied most pilots. Hull plates glowed as they skimmed the edges of weapon locks, metal screaming in protest. They were a gnat darting between the fingers of a god, but the gnat had the mind of an empress and the reflexes of a machine. A final, brutal surge threw Jake against the bulkhead. The redouts flared. Then suddenly, the pressure eased. The planet's gravity well fell away, and the stars sharpened. Hold on, Zara said. Hyperspace swallowed them in a flare of blue-white light. Veltani Prime was less a planet than a statement. As they dropped out of hyperspace, Jake saw a sphere wrapped in layers of engineered brilliance, interlocking rings of habitat, shipyards, and luminous corridors. A megastructure glittering like a jeweled cage around the world below. Traffic flows crisscrossed in disciplined arcs. Thousands of ships moving in patterns that looked random until you noticed the hidden order. Landing at the Imperial Palace was like waking from a fevered dream into someone else's legend. Crystalline spires reached toward the sky, refracting light into cascading colors. Courtyards flowed with translucent walkways and hovering platforms. Holographic banners displayed the Veltani crest, and beyond the palace walls, the vast cityscape pulsed with life. There, surrounded by the weight of millennia and the calculated elegance of power, the stakes of Zara's situation snapped into brutal focus. Admiral Var had already moved. Reports streamed in. The Eighth Fleet mobilized. Messages broadcast to the border systems declaring the Empress dead. Emergency councils convened without her. The Empire trembled on the brink of fracturing, old factions circling like vultures around the rumor of a vacant throne. The Chancellor urged the obvious solution. Rally loyalist fleets. Meet the Var in open battle. Burn a few systems to prove the throne still had teeth. Zara stood at a vast observation window, fleets glittering on sensor overlays, and said nothing. Jake watched her, seeing the strain around her eyes, the calculation behind her stillness. In the workshop, he'd seen her as a brilliant engineer and a stubborn patient. Here, in her own palace, the full weight of who she was pressed against him like gravity. Finally, she turned not to her generals, but to him. "You fixed my ship," she said quietly, "and you didn't bow once." "I grew up on a mining rock," Jake replied. "We don't really do bowing." "Bad for your back." Her mouth twitched. Then her gaze sharpened, as if she'd just reached a decision. "The old way is secrecy," she said. "Control. Hoarding knowledge as power. That's what the Var wants to protect. If I fight him on his terms, I win or I lose, but nothing changes. The rot remains." She looked back out at the incoming icons of the Var's fleet. "We won't fight them with weapons," she said. "We'll fight them with the future." The palace transformed in 48 frantic hours. War rooms became negotiation hubs. Holoconference channels opened to ambassadors, delegates, and leaders from 100 worlds within and beyond the Empire. What had once been heavily guarded research vaults disgorged their secrets in curated streams. Jake found himself shoved to the center of it all. He stood before representatives who had never before been invited into the heart of Veltani power, explaining neural interfaces in plain language, outlining sustainable energy grids, mapping advanced medical synthesis techniques onto colonial infrastructure systems. He translated the Empire's most guarded technologies into tools that could elevate border worlds and rivals alike. One question hung over every negotiation, unspoken but heavy. "Would you share your greatest secrets to save your future?" Zara did. She offered alliances not enforced by dreadnoughts, but by mutual investment. Access to imperial innovation in exchange for public recognition of her authority, and a formal commitment to a new, open charter. The coup foundation fear of a weak, bleeding out empire began to crumble as neighboring powers realized they had more to gain from her survival than her fall. By the time Admiral the Var's fleet arrived, bristling with weaponry and righteous fury, the tactical situation had shifted in ways he hadn't accounted for. He strode into the grand hall expecting to face an isolated Empress clinging to raw authority. Instead, he found her flanked by a coalition. Holographic presences of allied leaders hovered in a ring around the throne dais. Delegates from border systems he'd assumed too distant or too disinterested to matter stood at her side. Signed agreements glowed in the air. Treaties, technological pacts, mutual defense clauses. The Var's accusation of weakness died on his tongue as the reality of what she'd built crushed his narrative. He'd promised his followers that Zara's openness would doom the Empire. Instead, she'd parlayed it into something stronger, more interconnected, harder to topple with simple force. In the end, the coup didn't dissolve in heroic last stands or spectacular destruction. It withered under the weight of a better idea. The Eighth Fleet, faced with the prospect of firing on not just imperial loyalists, but a unified front of allies, hesitated. That hesitation grew into refusals, quiet stand-down orders, and abrupt course changes. The Var found himself commanding a rebellion that no longer wanted to burn the galaxy for his vision. He was escorted from the hall in silence. In the calm that followed, the immense machinery of diplomacy and integration began its slow, grinding work. Borders were redrawn, research teams assembled, new frameworks drafted. The future, as it turned out, required a lot of paperwork. Zara found Jake on a balcony overlooking Veltani Prime's city of light. Ships from 100 worlds moved in graceful arcs overhead, no longer poised for battle, but for exchange. The air hummed with distant engines and the low murmur of a civilization, shifting its weight onto new foundations. For a moment, the formality of the setting tried to reassert itself. Guards at the doors, advisors hovering at a careful distance. The Empress in ceremonial attire that amplified her presence into something almost mythic. But they had shared too many cramped corridors and near-death maneuvers to pretend. They were strangers separated by titles. "I have an offer for you," she said. Jake leaned on the railing. "If it's another ride in the luggage compartment, I'm going to pass." Her eyes warmed. "Chief Engineer for Interspecies Technological Cooperation," she said. "You'd lead the teams integrating our technologies with those of our new partners. It will be difficult, politically fraught, technically exhausting. Many opportunities to offend important people. So, endless challenges, constant headaches. And no guarantee I won't start an incident by swearing at a Duke's favorite engine," he summarized. Essentially, he was quiet for a moment, watching a convoy of ships rise from the lower docks, their hulls bearing the insignias of worlds that, a week ago, had never dreamed of docking here. "Will I still get to talk to you like a normal person?" he asked, not quite joking. "No bowing, no your imperial radiance, just conversations." Like in the workshop, she hesitated, then let the ceremonial mask slip, just a little. The smile she gave him was familiar, the same tired, genuine curve of her mouth he'd seen under flickering workshop lights. Grease on her fingers and a half-dismantled power core between them. "Just Zara," she said. Jake had spent most of his life salvaging the past, picking through the wreckage of other people's failures, coaxing a few more years out of old machines. It had always felt safer to live among ruins than on the bleeding edge of whatever came next. But standing on that balcony, watching the first cautious flows of a galaxy learning to trust itself, he realized that the future wasn't some distant, abstract thing. It was right here, messy and stubborn and terrifying, asking if he wanted in. He thought of the crash on Taos Three, of scorched sand and a broken ship that had no business surviving, of a woman who had rewritten the rules of her empire by deciding secrets could be tools instead of shackles. "Yeah," he said softly. "All right, let's see what we can build." He accepted the job, knowing the work would be hard and the politics worse. But the company and Empress, who preferred engineers to flatterers and a galaxy ready, finally, to stop pretending it could survive alone would be extraordinary. After all, the best stories don't end at the crash site. They begin with the repair,